Okay, we're going to get going again. Someone else pointed out to me that on the agenda, not in the respondent panel, but in the respondent panel, Vincent Schiraldi, in fact, does not work at the New York City Department of Probation. Where is he? He's not in the room? He missed it. Okay, we're going to now talk to or hear from three of the star professors at John Jay College who were invited to comment on Close to Home and the previous conversation from their own perspectives, their own disciplines, their own work. And what we hope to do is have each of them make a brief statement and comments on what they've heard and what they've read about this, and then open it up to you to have a conversation with us, with them, ask questions, go back and forth. So this is after they make their opening statements, and we may go around the table a little bit, but it's designed, this is the first opportunity for all of us to speak as a group. We will have, who's volunteered to run the microphone around the room? Whoever's willing to do that from the John Jay team, let's get that organized in advance so you can be ready when the time comes. Sarah jumps into the fray. Okay, so I think we'll start off hearing from Karen Martin, who's in the Department of Public Management. Professor Martin.
Hi, good morning. How's this sound?
Closer.
No,
really close.
no, hello. Yes? I was looking over there because I was sitting over there and couldn't hear anything. Okay, so I'm from the Public Management Department. My background is in public policy, so I'm going to be talking about the policy perspectives on this topic. And Jeff asked me specifically if this is an exceptional problem. And I was surprised that would be an interesting question, because to me it's patently obvious that no, it's not exceptional, that the criminal justice field is not exceptional in terms of having very complex problems, that's standard in public policy. And in fact, we have something called a wicked problem in policy, and I think this might resonate with you. A wicked problem is characterized by such things such as it's very difficult or impossible to solve due to incomplete, contradictory, or ever-changing requirements. And the wicked in wicked problem doesn't necessarily mean mean or evil. It can just mean resistance to a solution. And that solution, the resistance can come from very well-meaning people who are armed with statistics, people who are armed with funding. It's just that everybody has a different take on the problem, and that's what makes it wicked. And yet, I think that great progress is being made. And the fact that there are so many different ways to see a problem, in policy we call this the problem definition, and ideally you have a clear problem definition. Maybe you're working with a client or a government and they tell you this is the problem we need to solve, go fix it, policy analyst. And what usually happens is that problem definition that you're given is absolutely not the problem at all. And your job is to go back and say, actually your problem is this. And what I see, and what's already been talked about some, is that this iterative process of a problem is, in this situation, coming up in terms of the difference in opinion between, was it the goal to reduce the number of placements, or was it to improve the quality of placements? And I believe that those are actually not mutually exclusive, that those divergent goals aren't actually as divergent as they may seem. And I say that from experience in policy. I'll just give you one example that I'm currently involved in, which is in policing, where again, fraught, horrible, wicked, complex problem, so many differences of opinion, so many horrible things happening every day, but deeply entrenched beliefs about how policing should work at every level. And I was just at the Department of Justice, where there was a convening of academics, practitioners, so police chiefs, and advocates, people working on civil rights. And to me, this means that it's actually possible to not just talk about should we stop stopping people, but you want to both reduce the number of stops, but make people's experience with police better at the same time, right? You don't want to trample the rights. You want them to understand justice and feel that they've been treated fairly. So I think it's analogous, that it's actually a good thing to pursue both reducing the number of placements and making them better at the same time. Another thing we have in public policy is incrementalism. And this is the idea that rarely do you get a chance to completely from scratch create a brand new beautiful policy. You're always pushing at the boundary. You're always trying to make things slightly better every time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with budgeting. Same thing. You never start a budget from scratch. You go back to last year's budget and you make changes. Same idea in policy. And I see that this, there's classic examples like healthcare, right? Healthcare has been on the policy agenda in this country for decades, century, or getting close to the century mark probably. Every year something new changes. There's slight changes in what's covered or what doctors get. That's what I'm talking about. And the same is happening in policing with incrementalism. And what I think is important to know about that is it's kind of a reason to never give up hope and to never become cynical, because change is always being made. And again, this goes back to the divergent goals. If you're more concerned with reducing placements, or if you're more concerned with improving the quality, it's actually, you want to be pressing on both of those boundaries at the same time. And that's totally standard fare. The final thing I want to say about policy is implementation. And what I see is that we're kind of in the brink getting the first results of this new policy. And again, from my own experience, I've worked a lot with sentencing guidelines. And if you know anything about sentencing, so especially the federal level, this is where I did a lot of my work. So the idea was that we'll take away discretion from judges, we'll have a literal grid, like a 117 by 30 column grid, where judges say, oh, this person has this criminal history and this offense level, they get this number of months, and that's it. That's supposed to be the end. Of course, it is far messier than that. But one of the main findings is that what this did was just shift discretion from the judges to the prosecutors. So the prosecutors now get more power to decide those first two inputs, how much criminal history, how much offense level. The things that prosecutors do can inform those two inputs, which then informs where the judge's decision, where it constrains the judges even more. In my own research, I found that more important than either one of those is that way back when, monetary sentences in general, the use of money to punish, the idea was to help keep people out of prison. It was part of the original alternative sanction movement. We could fine people, we can keep them out of prison. That's fine and great. It's better for the state, it costs us less money, it's better for people. Of course, it doesn't work that way. What we see is that people are getting sent away and being assessed these monetary penalties. And my main takeaway from this is that to find that kind of outcome, you really need to keep pursuing rigorous and creative sources of data. So for example, I find that women are more likely to be assessed a fine, and that fine is more likely to be higher. And this is when you're controlling for every possible thing you can imagine controlling for: offense level, type of offense, number of defendants, where they came from, what district they were sentenced in. All of those things being held constant, women are still being treated more punitively. And that is not something that's at all readily apparent. It actually took some real statistical analysis and massaging of the data to figure that out. And I think that it's analogous in this situation, that there are probably outcomes that are important to know, and that as opposed to being stuck on the basic statistics of how many placements there are and what their one or two outcomes are, I think that we need to be really creative as we pursue this. And that's the question I would leave you with, is what kind of more rigorous and creative data do we need in order to actually assess all the outcomes?
Thank you. And of course, when you really start reading the history of crime and punishment corrections, you eventually find the story that prisons were invented as an alternative. And the reason they were called penitentiaries is because that's where we sent people to be penitent, and it was an alternative to physical punishment, to stocks and hangings and lashes. And so, yeah, every time we invent something that we think would be a more humane alternative, somehow we turn it into the focus of punishment efforts. We're next going to hear from Professor Layla Kazemian. And those of you who see her name on the agenda, don't call her Lila. Her name is spelled L-I-L-A, but it's Layla. And she's in the Department of Sociology, even though every time I think of you, I know you studied with David Farrington, I always think of you as a psychologist, and that's not right, is it? Yeah. And Layla's going to talk about some of her work and experiences with this whole issue of crime and punishment and correctional. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. I couldn't hear over there either, so you guys good?
Just have to get very close.
Very close? All right. So Jeff is famously vague with his instructions for these presentations, so let's see how this goes.
No, it's freedom. I gave you freedom.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm a criminologist by training. My area of research is I study offending patterns across time, including during periods of incarceration. So what happens to people's offending behaviors?
Louder.
What happens to people's offending behaviors?
Louder and closer.
Closer.
Where's the audio,
Better?
guys?
Is this good? Okay. So essentially how people, the focus is on why people stop committing crime over time. So that's been my main area of research. What I want to talk about today is essentially a little bit about the effects of confinement versus alternative sanctions. The key point that I want to raise today is that the effectiveness of any criminal justice modality depends much more on the conditions of the modality than on the actual modality itself. So incarceration, for instance, doesn't need to have all these negative repercussions that it has currently. We're just not employing it in a strategic way. In the US, if you go visit some prisons in Europe, you can see that they don't have the same negative consequences that we have here. So Rob Sampson just wrote a piece a few years ago saying that we went through two eras in incarceration research. We went through an era in the 1980s where the focus was on deterrence and selective incapacitation and punishment, where we were highlighting the positive effects of incarceration. And now we've moved over to this movement where we talk about the negative effects of mass incarceration. And so we have this dualistic view of prison. It's either good or bad. And this view also applies to community, to alternatives to prison. We tend to view them as either good or bad without weighing the positive and negative aspects of it. So surprisingly, we still have some important gaps in our knowledge when it relates to the effects of incarceration on individuals in the long term. So there's two camps of assessment in this research. There's the psychological literature that says that the effects of incarceration are actually largely minimal. That there's, when you have long-term follow-ups, that some individuals actually end up adapting to life in prison and that it doesn't have such detrimental effects. And then you have the sociologists and the criminal justice scholars who repeatedly highlight the damaging effects of incarceration. And so we know that there's, for instance, a significant prevalence of traumatic experiences and mental health problems among the prison population, but we don't know if it's prison that has led to these problems or whether prison has exacerbated a pre-existing condition among these individuals. So some of the recent studies that have been done with really strong methodological frameworks, so that's part of the problem in trying to draw conclusions from research, is a lot of the methodologies are flawed. But some of the recent research that's been done based on really, really strong methodologies, so using either matched samples or controlling for conditions prior to incarceration, show that when you include the relevant control variables and characteristics of individuals before they entered prison, that the actual effect of incarceration on psychiatric disorders can be quite marginal. So in essence, it's not necessarily, it's how we measure it, first of all, and I'm sure you'll talk about assessment as well, but it's also the conditions of the modality as well. So not all research, so we know that psychological well-being and health outcomes tend to vary during periods of confinement, but there's really been, and this relates to what we're talking about today, no systematic assessment over time of changes in physical and psychological variables over time, and that's going to be one of the points I want to raise here. So all I'm trying to say here is that it's not black or white when it comes to either incarceration or other community-based alternatives to prison. So I want to address a few of the questions that have been raised in the report, in the summary of the report. The first question that was raised by Evan earlier was whether close to home was about cost effectiveness. So Michael Tonry would argue that it's never about cost effectiveness, that policymakers do what they think is right, what's the right thing to do. So it doesn't matter if it's going to be really expensive and not effective. If there's a feeling that that's the right thing to do, then that's what's going to be done. This is the argument that he raised when he criticized Todd Clear's point about justice reinvestment. He's saying you shouldn't frame that argument in terms of saving costs because that's not what's going to appeal to people. Policymakers in particular, do what they think is the right thing to do. So, and this kind of leads me to the point of because incarceration rates or confinement rates had reached such a high point, we've almost been desperate in a sense to reduce that quickly. And that's always a danger when you're in a desperate situation, you're rushing sort of a revolution and you're moving towards methods that haven't been properly evaluated. So the question is that, should we wait till we get it perfectly, of course, which will never happen, or is it better than doing nothing even though it has its limitations? So while it may be better than keeping the status quo, the danger is always that we end up keeping those measures that were not quite properly evaluated in the long term. So that's always one of the dangers of moving too quickly from one measure to another. The third question that was raised in the summary that was interesting to me is whether close to home was actually designed. Was it realistic to assume that it was designed to keep kids out of the system, to reduce recidivism? So we know that multimodal interventions are most effective. So it's not only placing someone in prison or an alternative to prison or having them somewhere that's closer to their families, it's the other programs that they're participating in simultaneously. So we have to look at it, I guess, as a system and less so as people being in the community or being in confinement. So again, this is part of the evaluation. I think that's a piece of the puzzle that's still missing. And the last point I want to raise is about effectiveness. So whether close to home promised too much, whether it placed individuals in a setting that's perhaps too similar to the incarceration setting. So any analysis that we tend to do in evaluation relies on official data. And that's largely, I think, in some sense, it gives us some valuable information, but it only gives one snapshot of the full picture. So there might be, even though these early evaluations, which Evan presented as well, so we see that we don't see that many significant results at this point. What we need to do is be speaking to the youth who have been affected by this program. And, you know, there might be some changes in attitudes and behaviors that are not detected in official records. We need to be asking about self-reported offending. You know, because we know that the process of change and the process of desistance from crime is exactly that, a process, and it's not something that occurs abruptly. If we only document things that we can observe immediately, we might be missing out on some key changes that are occurring gradually through this process. So the program may actually have more effects than we actually think. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Carla Barrett, who's also in the Department of Sociology here at John Jay. And when you talk to Carla, you know right away you're talking to a sociologist. She and I were at a reception last week and had a conversation, and I said, I'm getting so tired of hearing people talk about criminal thinking. And she said, I know. So if you say the word criminal thinking to someone and they look like they smelled something bad, you're probably talking to a sociologist. Because you know, focusing all our efforts on criminal thinking would make sense if we were trying to change Wall Street, just as much as if we're trying to change the behavior of people on probation.
Or Washington, D.C.
Or Washington,
Anyway.
D.C.
Thank you for that. Just a little bit of background quickly. I am in the Department of Sociology. I have studied issues of juvenile delinquency for years now. And unlike a... Oh, can you hear?
Sorry. Get really close.
Unlike a lot of people, I have to hold, I'm too tall. Will this come off? There we go.
And then you can drop it when you're done.
No. Is that better? Okay. I am a sociologist. I've been studying issues related to, I don't even like the term juvenile delinquency. I think it's a term from the 1940s. And I'm not really particularly interested as a researcher, as a sociologist, in understanding sort of why kids do what they do. My research is mostly focused on examining how the system chooses to respond. So if I had to sort of put a label on my research, I would say it's the sociology of punishment, and particularly for juveniles. I did a lot of work, my dissertation research and other things, on trying youth as adults in New York, so that is really my shtick. And I did research in the Manhattan Youth part and these other things. So when I started doing research around these issues around 15 years ago, it was dark and gloomy. It was very, very dark and gloomy. So it's been wonderful to sort of observe the changes over time and initiatives like this and the Raise the Age campaign that is actually part of a conversation that didn't even exist 5-10 years ago. At the same time, I also think it's my job as a critical criminologist to always be being the voice of concern and question and critique. And I'm going to do a little bit of that right now, but not in any way, shape, or form to sort of take away from all that has been done here. I don't want to disparage Close to Home. I think it's an amazing initiative. The way that so many different stakeholders were able to be brought together to affect this change is one more reason I'm proud to be a New Yorker. And I applaud you all and all the agencies that are involved. But reading the report, I thought a lot of the questions posed at the beginning were really good questions, and I'm waiting to find out the answers. So I don't know if that's going to come in the final report or not. I think there is this question of sort of further evaluating what close to home will do or what it can do. And I don't think we should put all of our eggs in the close to home basket. I think this initiative sits inside of a much larger infrastructure of responses to youthful offending that we need to be aware of, and that we do need to raise the age, and that we do need to work on prevention initiatives and a whole bunch of other things. That to say, oh, look, we fixed the problem by moving kids closer to home or reduced placement is only one part of a very large puzzle that fits across multiple systems. I think one really significant, really laudable outcome is the education outcomes, is the ability of kids to not lose credits, to be able to return to home schools, to have education significantly less disrupted is just a really important piece that a lot of people may not be looking at. But we know that education reduces recidivism. We just sort of know this in various ways. And so the fewer kids that drop out, the fewer educational experiences that are disrupted by placement are all, I think, incredibly important and probably need to be highlighted. I'm a little concerned because of the kind of research I do with what's going to happen or how this initiative will affect what I like to call the serious kids, or what Judge Corriero used to call the kids that are hard to love, which is the secure placement kids, and what, if any, is sort of being done for them. I think if you look at the adolescent diversion parts that Judge Littman set up, again, we're dealing with the misdemeanor cases, but we haven't moved to sort of the more serious. And there is a lot of criminological literature that says if you intervene with more serious offenders, you will get more bang for your buck. And actually, if you get involved too much with low-level offenders, you can actually have a negative outcome. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, so a lot of you know this. So I'm real curious to see, okay, what's happened with the serious kids? Whether it's, are they coming close to home, or what, if anything, how are the placements changing to positively affect change? Another thing I think is interesting is we talk about evaluation. I'm glad that Layla mentioned talking to kids. I saw a lot of stakeholders were interviewed for this report. I'm a qualitative researcher, and if you want to know how things affect kids, go talk to the kids. I once had a reporter call me in my office at John Jay from some newspaper and say, she wanted a soundbite, can you explain to me why kids in Brownsville join gangs? And I was in a little bit of a bad mood that day, and I said, if you want to know why kids in Brownsville join gangs, go talk to kids in Brownsville. And the conversation sort of stopped there. But I sort of mean it, right? I think families, kids, they can tell us a lot, and stuff that doesn't always get registered in official statistics. Particularly the gold standard for any sort of evaluation in criminal justice policy tends to be recidivism rates. And I would caution anyone and everyone that is dealing with them to be highly critical of what recidivism rates can actually tell you. Especially if you're looking at rearrest data. Rearrest data often can tell you more about police activity than can actually tell you about criminal offending. When you have kids getting arrested for trespassing in their neighbors' buildings and these sorts of things, I think we really need to look closely at what the official statistics we gather are. So recidivism studies are the gold standard. We have to do them, but I think we have to think about doing them creatively and in ways that can help us understand that just because a kid got rearrested doesn't mean that your program wasn't successful. And I could go on forever about that, but I won't. One concern I have is watching Close to Home go forward is the variety of different nonprofits that are involved in providing services. And I know that they're all doing really good work, but I wonder about the consistency across the system and how that could be monitored and oversight. And I believe the Missouri model in Missouri is actually services are provided by, they're all Missouri sort of state employees, part of one particular structure. And I don't know that that's better. But I know in New York we do have this history of sort of outsourcing. And I think that can be good, but I think it can also be problematic. And as we go forward and as evaluations of close to home happen, I think it's something that we should really pay attention to. So I think that's all I really wanted to say right now.
Okay, thank you. You know, as I'm looking down the table, I know I'm getting older, but look how undergraduates are looking awful young to me these days. The students out there on the lawn.
Oh no.
They're having much more fun than we are. Okay, where's the microphone? Does anyone have a question, a comment, a criticism, want to object to something they heard, want to fill us in on something about close to home that we clearly do not understand? Any and all comments and questions are welcome. Someone has to go first. Yes. Doesn't work? Crystalline, does yours work?
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering if you could talk...
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Elise White from the Midtown Community Court. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the research concerns you have are with criminal thinking and the focus on that as part of sort of the complex of risk need assessment.
Anyone?
Well, anyone, really.
Go ahead. Well, I've been doing a lot of research recently, which has put my head into psych literature. That's all I've been reading is psychological journal articles, and I've learned a lot, and I've also gotten somewhat frustrated about sort of the designs. I think they're, I'm a sociologist. People don't exist in isolation. They, are involved in interaction and community and settings and structures. And I think sometimes, and this is just sort of a general observation of the system in general, we will pluck a kid out of that's messed up and say we have to fix you. And then we throw that kid back out into the exact same interactional setting, whether it's family setting, whether it's community setting, whether it's an abandoned education system, and then we tell them they have to act right. And we should not be surprised that we don't always have success. And so I think as much as you do need to intervene with kids, I think we need to find ways to help them cope with those larger structures or larger forces. And Layla mentioned trauma. And this is another thing I've had my head in the trauma literature for the last 3 weeks. And if anyone now wants to talk to me about kids in the system, the first thing I'm going to say is trauma. Like, it's profound, the rates of trauma that these kids suffer as opposed to kids that aren't in placement. And if we're not dealing with that, like, profoundly, creatively, and I'm going to steal something that Nina said to me about not just trauma-informed care, but trauma-responsive care. And because they suffer trauma in their communities, they're going to go back out into their communities and witness violence in ways that will be traumatic. So how do we develop coping skills that allow them to find ways to function inside of the structures of poverty and neighborhood dysfunction that exist? Unless we can end poverty and solve neighborhood issues, okay, let's work on that, okay? But in the meantime, for those of us that are, well, I'm just an outsider looking in, but for those of you that are actually working with kids, is to really understand the set of arrangements inside which they exist. So yes, criminal thinking is one thing, but I think we need to think much larger about how to help them exist and find alternative pathways within the settings that they are going to return home to if we're not going to just keep them all in placement. So and how we evaluate that, I don't know that I know. I still think talking to kids might be a really good way to do it. I just got through doing interviews last year with a bunch of young men that had gone through one of the ATIs. They were 18 to 24-year-olds about their experiences, and it's really quite profound what they will tell you about what worked and what didn't about what they got in the program. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
So we got 10 minutes. I think that's probably good for 2 or 3 questions.
Can I add to that
I'm
question?
sorry, yes.
Sorry, yeah. Just the whole concept of criminal thinking is a bit tricky because, first of all, we don't really agree on how to measure it. And second of all, I mean, there's very few traits that you can say this is only associated with crime. You can use it in a different context for something else, so it's difficult to identify those traits. What we do know from the research is personality traits. For instance, the Big Five inventory is something that shows that there are certain stability in personality traits that are observed over time, and those can be useful, but it's not a typology, it's a continuum. It's not you're this or you're that. You're scoring this much on this, and then you can sort of look at progress over time. And I think that's a much more useful framework. Putting people in groups is problematic because people change all the time. You do an interview with them this week, they'll give you certain answers, and you speak to them in 2 weeks, and their answers they might be completely different based on what happened, you know? So it's always, and as people who, you know, when you're talking to them and you're documenting this and you're pigeonholing them, that's one of the issues with these kinds of scales, that you're either that or you're not. So I find the continuum approach is much more useful.
Just one more thing on that is that I would echo what Layla just said and point out specifically that attitudes are known to be so variable and context dependent. And what is really problematic about criminal thinking is that it tends to become this essentialized concept in people's brains. So even though we have an action word of thinking, we stop at criminal, and so people just become criminals. We're not really thinking about their thinking. We're just saying criminal. That's just cognitively what happens, and so it tends to stop the difficult part of saying how is this thinking going to affect behavior? How is it different? You know, we can think of ourselves. Well, I have consumer thinking. What does that make me? I mean, it just doesn't really hold up rigorously once you press on the concept very much.
Other questions?
Hi.
Who's got? Oh, Felipe.
Okay. How are you? Felipe Franco, Deputy Commissioner at ACS, Division of Youth and Family Justice. And I wanted to comment on Carla's comment. I mean, and others. I mean, close to home, and I'm sure the Commissioner is going to talk about that more. It has never been in our mind, particularly in the new administration, about just changing youth thinking. It's not about cognitive restructuring. I mean, the opportunity that we see, and having run the state system, is that we have an investment of resources that used to be in Ithaca, New York, that now we can bring to Brownsville. So when we think about the work of close to home, it's going to be, sure, we want to provide treatment, we want to provide abilities for kids to develop competencies and skills, but we really want to change who they connect to and who they relate to, and we want to build in those relationships. I mean, for us, it's more important than the psyche and the circle in the genogram, those lines of who they're connected to. So a lot of the work and the promise, I think Jeremy could talk about some of the work we're doing even with Children's Village, is going to be refocusing more on the family and the context and the ecology than just a kid. And that's what we need to do now.
Hi, I had a follow-up question for Carla.
And identify yourself, Julie.
I'm Julie Peterson with the Pinkerton Foundation, and I want to applaud your call to talk to youth if you want to find out what's going on with them. But you ended your comments by talking about this research you did last year and how it was surprising what youth said worked for them and didn't. And I wondered if you could share some of the details of that.
I could go on forever, and I won't, because I've just been writing up this article. I actually worked with I was doing research around a particular intervention that was doing programming at the ATI that was teaching yoga and meditation to these guys. It's called the Lineage Project. Most of you probably know Beth Navon. She used to be the ED of Island Academy, and she now runs this program. And they do programming in Horizons Crossroads. They're in a couple of the close-to-home facilities, I know, doing programming. And, you know, these guys get all kinds of programming at the ATI. So how do we even assess what this little piece of the classes that were going on did anything? And so I just posed that question. I did long, open-ended interviews with about 10 of them, and I said, what was the difference between this and like basically your anger management, because they all had to do anger management. And they all spoke really beautifully about how doing, as opposed to talking about anger, like actually, because there was an experiential component. And they said, other than the cooking class and the yoga class, everything else was just sitting around talking. And they had really profound things to say about that. And I think it gave them new ways to think about themselves, just asking them to move differently, particularly young men from some of these communities to do yoga poses. I mean, it's so much fun. And there's a lot of giggling, but it allows them to start thinking about a new way to deal with themselves and really new ways to deal with stress. And they told me some very profound things about how in confrontations on the street, they took these practices and were able to sort of make better choices. So I think changing thinking is really important, but is it only doable through sort of cognitive behavioral talk therapy? What other kinds of ways, whether it's yoga, whether it's sports, whether it's art? I have a friend that teaches dance at Sing Sing, and she has tremendous outcomes with the guys. And again, it is often about finding new ways to imagine themselves being in the world. And those are really intangible. I think they're really hard to measure and evaluate. But because I asked these guys what worked, and this is what they told me, and it kind of did blow me away because I wasn't expecting this. So that's just one example where I think thinking creatively about, especially young people, they need to move, they're physical. And if we're only thinking about changing their psyches, I think we only get sort of so far. So.
Mark, in the middle here, needs a mic. He had his hand up.
Mark Ferranti, Department of Probation. Thanks, Jeff. I was trying to tie together, again, something that Carla said with something that Evan said when he was up there earlier. You talked about that close to home really needs to fit into the bigger picture, that it isn't an end unto itself. I believe that you, Evan, you spoke about that one of the central questions being asked in this report is, has close to home, in fact, helped continue the reform efforts that were underway over the last decade, or has it in some sense actually sort of blunted some of those and created its own sort of a force? And I'm wondering ultimately whether the report can or will address how close to home continues to fit into the broader reforms. When I think about, we have a non-secure placement plan on the books, we have a limited secure placement plan somewhere on the books. We now have a commission about studying raise the age. But again, in terms of putting all of these pieces together, including, as Carla said, the deepest end kids, do you think that there'll be something in the final report that will speak to how to bring all of these elements together to propel us into the next decade of reform?
Well, since the question's about the report, I would encourage you to get on the website and make that comment. Because we, as a group, and as Evan mentioned, the person who got this report started has had to move back to Spain because she worked for the federal government, and they said if you don't come back now, we may not be able to hold your position. But we're in email contact with her, and we will be willing to add whatever comment the field thinks that, or whatever content the field thinks needs to be added to that report, and I think those are good points. Hernan?
Good morning. I'm Hernan Carvente from the Vera Institute. Ms. Barrett, you mentioned the serious offenders or the youth that are hard to love. And I'm actually very thankful that you mentioned that particular population only because of my personal background, which I'm sure plenty of people have heard here, where me having been in the secure placement. But as a question to the panel as a whole, I mean, what are some things that, policymakers and everyone should be taking a close look at right now with regard to serious violent offenders? Because I think Close to Home has addressed or is trying to address the less serious offenders and trying to really work with them so as to prevent any more incarceration of young people. But what are some of the concerns that perhaps some of you might have in mind in terms of serious offenders, and how do we deal with young people who commit these violent crimes?
Part of the problem, and this is by no means specific to New York or to the U.S., well, it is a little bit more specific to the U.S., but it's to treat basically juveniles sometimes as adults. And that's, I mean, there's this, in developmental criminology, we talk about the importance of early prevention, but this is beyond the scope of the conversation here. What do you do once they're in the system, once they've begun to engage in these acts? So there's certainly ways that the system can react to aggravate those behaviors. And there's a lot of research that suggests that stigmatization, so labeling people, putting them, sort of making them feel as though they're a distinct group of individuals and that they cannot reintegrate back into their group with their peers, can have really damaging effects on individuals' identities and subsequently their behaviors. So identity, I think, is key in this process with serious violent offenders. If they are labeled as such, I think they're just going to continue to engage in those behaviors because that's what's expected of them. So it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there are ways, I think, that we can react that can, they will always be more, we have to be realistic. They have more risk factors than other individuals. They will always be more at risk than other individuals who don't have those early risk factors, but that doesn't mean that they can't change. So we can either attenuate the effect of those risk factors or we can aggravate them.
And I would just add there are models of programs out there for serious intervention with the serious offenders that have shown somewhat tremendous success in certain ways. I think that trying youth as adults, again, because this is what I study, we now have 15 years worth of research. It doesn't work on any level. And we need to fundamentally, we need to not do away with the JO offender law. We need to raise the age and actually make New York, a champion for the fact that there's no measures at all on which trying youth as adults works. So I think that is one thing that the system is doing in response. It is actually exacerbating. Sorry, I can never say that word. Making the problem worse for the serious offenders. As far as response, I think here you're going to find trauma. You're going to find multiple trauma. You're going to find complex trauma. You're going to find mental illness due to trauma. And I also think family is really important within these. Most of the serious offenders, from what I've read, if you're 14 and you're a serious offender, there's been some stuff going wrong for a long time. And I was talking to a defense attorney the other night that said, you know what, some of our kids want to be as far away from home as they can be. And I think that, this idea that we get them close to home is a good thing. For some kids, maybe they need to be out of the gang environment. They need to be out of the family environment. Maybe they need to be out of the family gang environment because that's where they learn this. And I think that one size fits all may not always work. So, and again, talk to them, not to repeat myself, but they can probably tell you what they need more than anything.